Hello, welcome to this workshop on flawed character with me, Luke Palmer. Thank you to the lovely people at YALC for having me, and thank you to you for coming along. We're going to talk today about some of the ideas and techniques that went into writing my first novel, Grow, that came out in July this year. Obviously, in Grow, I take some of these ideas to quite a disturbing place. I'm not going to make you do that today. I'd like to keep this workshop quite light, quite cheerful. What I'd like you to do is to pick your own level of safety with some of these ideas we're going to play around with today. As writers, I think we have a responsibility sometimes to go to disturbing and worrying places with some of the things we're writing about. We also need ways to keep ourselves safe, I think. So today, please don't overstep any boundaries. You put up your own limitations in terms of what you want to write about. Please don't let this workshop take you down anywhere that you do not want to go. So in terms of what we're going to achieve today, we're going to get some writing done. In an ideal world, that writing will prompt some more writing, the best kind of writing, potential writing, writing where we've got an idea buzzing away or itching away at us. We're also going to have a discussion with me in my living room and you, wherever you may be, about how individual actions can fit into and perhaps even create the framework for your novel, for your narrative. And we're also going to talk about morality and where morality fits in and is manifest in your novel, in your writing. For me, writing is a kind of alchemical process that sits at the midpoint of an hourglass. If you imagine an hourglass that can run both ways at once. From the bottom of the hourglass kind of percolating up, you've got craft, technique, all of those kind of things that you need as a writer. And at the top, you've got the big ideas, the big responsibilities, the things that you would like to communicate to your reader. And the writing process kind of exists at the point where those two things meet. You've got kind of craft bubbling up and the ideas coming down. And we're writing at this kind of point where everything's coming together in the narrowest, most kind of condensed way it possibly can. A brief bit of housekeeping before we start. You can pause me at any time, goes without saying, it's the internet, isn't it? Spend a bit longer on an activity, or if you want to go back over something, you're going to need some scrap paper, and you're obviously going to need a pen with that scrap paper. Whatever you write on, it's entirely up to you. I'm a big believer in the kind of, particularly in the workshop where ideas come through the hand onto paper. I'm a big believer in the notebook. But if you want to go straight onto screen, that's entirely up to you. You're also perhaps going to want some refreshment. For when I do start waffling on. So whatever tickles your fancy, then yeah, grab one of those and we'll be ready to begin. So ready for liftoff, and we will crack on. Okay, part one in which we do some writing. The first thing I'm going to ask you to do is grab your scrap paper and I'd like you to draw a table. I'd like you to draw a table that's got 3 columns in it, a heading and a little bank for each. What we're going to create is something I'm going to call the matrix of minor misdemeanors. So you're going to need 3 columns. You're going to need an action column, an object column and an adverb column. Knock that up now. In your first column, I would like you to write down 6 verbs, 6 actions that might in some way be a little bit naughty, breaking something or smashing something, even just throwing something away. You pick your level of intensity here. 6 verbs in that first column, a little bit wrong, a little bit naughty, please. Okay, in the second column, I'd like you to write down 6 objects. Common or garden objects are absolutely fine. Whatever's around you, just kind of don't think about it too much. These are things that the actions are going to get performed upon. So if you want to keep it small, pens, photographs, whatever. If you want to escalate that to laptops or windows, maybe even cars, something like that, entirely up to you. But 6 objects in that second column, please. The third column is for some adverbs, some adverbials. So if you want to go with a couple of just standard adverbs, slowly, methodically, something like that, with gustos, on a whim, anything that's going to give you a state of mind or a state of how the action is going to be performed, anything like that. So anything adverbial in that third column, please. 6 of those. So now you've got a completed matrix of minor misdemeanors, or maybe not so minor. What you're going to do is you're going to pick one offering from each column and you're going to create a scenario. You're going to do a piece of writing based on that. You're going to do that for 10 minutes and I'd like you to write that in the I voice, please. Something happens when we read in the I voice in the first person, or when we write as well. The neurological mechanisms are firing off as if we were doing that action on a slightly smaller scale. And I think it's really important to kind of, get ourselves embroiled in that today. Please don't get too bogged down in the whys for now. Don't worry about background. We'll come to that, I promise. You're just going to write your character in the first person doing whatever your matrix of minor misdemeanors tells you to do. Really go heavy on sensory detail would be the one steer I'd give you. You know, the kind of the sumptuousness of grinding a Christmas decoration into the ground with the heel of your shoe. The kind of smell of glue and horsehair and dust as you pull apart that old first edition Victorian children's novel that you were saving from your grandparents. Whatever it may be, but really go heavy on the detail. Okay, 10 minutes. Off you go. Okay, writing done. Welcome back to part 2. Good job. Okay, we're now going to look at the event as a pivotal moment then in our wider writing, a wider narrative. The idea of writing in and out again of events like this. There's a scene about 4/5 of the way through Ian McEwan's Enduring Love where the main character goes off to buy a gun. In an interview, McEwan said that was the first chapter he wrote. The rest of the novel kind of unwound from that starting point. Why would a seemingly reasonable character be looking for a gun? Now you've got your written event. You can work backwards. You can write the way into that immoral act. You can add on that emotional baggage that's going to make your reader identify or not, or empathise or not with your I. Full disclosure, I find it really hard to write that way, out of sync. I do my planning first. I know where I want my characters to get to, where I want them to go. However, they very rarely get there by the route that I first imagine. They do stuff along the way that I wasn't expecting. And I like that idea that these moments, these things that characters do are pivotal. A novel, coming back to that hourglass metaphor, a novel can be seen as a series of these hourglass events where everything we know about character and previous events falls through the narrow point, that needle eye of this immoral act, and we can then trace that knowledge of what happens in this event out to everything that happens beyond that. Almost like the moment in the novel becomes the narrow run of intense rapids. It's over before you know it, but afterwards, when the water kind of stills again and moves into another wider space, you can see the kind of the trace lines of what's happened before in those future moments. There's a moment in Grow that I imagined that way as I was writing it, and it becomes the sum of all the parts that had existed in this character up until that point. It also becomes the catalyst for the final part of the novel, I think. Once the character's been through that moment, he's different. Oddly, it wasn't a moment I planned at all. It came out of the blue, but it set up the rest of the novel, or at least the next part of the novel, in a way that I hadn't really expected. But it definitely brought out a few issues in that central character, brought them to the fore. I guess I subscribe quite a lot to Henry James's idea that you've probably heard before. He said, "What is character but the determination of incident, and what is incident but the illustration of character?" So characters are what they do, and what happens to characters is what creates character, basically. So by virtue of who they are, characters create their own incidents in a way. They create their own plot as a result of how they react to what's going on around them. And that plot moulds them further as characters. So writing Grow, for me, was just as much about discovering a character as it evolved as it was about telling the narrative, telling the story. But I also kind of have a bit of a problem with Henry James's assertion. It's a little bit Hobbesian for me. It's a little bit state of nature. You know, you've got the individual on one hand, then you've got the cruel world on the other. Any character of depth, to me, has several different forces working on them at once, particularly young characters. They exist in this kind of network of other characters, other expectations, social, familial, all that kind of stuff. So they can't really be seen, I don't think, as individuals acting wholly for themselves or on their own. But they are definitely moulded by those events they go through, and to a certain extent they create them. To me, it's a bit of a balancing act. Anyway, enough of me waffling on. Let's do some more writing, shall we? Whose object was it that you wrote about in that first exercise? That person who owned that object that just got destroyed, smashed, poked, prodded, is just about to enter the space. And you're going to write that person, that victim, shall we say, that victim's reaction as witnessed from your original I perspective. Okay? There may be interaction if they speak to each other, your two characters, go with it, but let your I character react in whatever way feels natural. They might be apologetic, they might be belligerent, they might not react at all, they might just observe. But the person that owned that object is about to come in and see what's happened. How is your I going to describe that, going to watch that, going to react to that? Give yourself 10 minutes. See you in a minute. Welcome back to part 3, which I'm going to call the physics of action, energy and transfer. So, with morality, or any actions that explore the moral grey area, Newton's third law of motion, I think, is a really good one to keep in mind, that every action has an equal and opposite reaction. It's one of my favourite Newtonian laws. Maybe you saw that in the piece of writing you just did, where your new character's come in, has seen what the first character's done, maybe there's been an equal and opposite reaction, or maybe not. Maybe that energy is stored. We'll talk about that in a second. Events in books, particularly ones that are asking questions about morality or ethics or the goodness or the badness of a character, these events are physical things. They contain energy. When an event happens, the energy of that action sparks quite often a reaction. It might not be an obvious and direct reaction, but that energy has to go somewhere. The energy of breaking a laptop, the energy of grinding that Christmas decoration into the floor, it creates something that needs to go somewhere, right? If nothing else, that energy gets stored, and that's what creates tension in a book. So perhaps your two characters in your piece of writing, there's not been that reaction yet, so that energy is kind of doubling up, and that's where our tension comes from. You can feel it, can't you, in some books or in some pieces of writing that we're doing. You can feel that stored energy. It becomes a pretty oppressive force. There's a lot of that stored energy in Grow, actually, and at times it got quite claustrophobic to write, the weight of this energy and expectation that you've had all this action. Where is the reaction going to come out? And that weighs on the characters, even when, or especially when they're trying to ignore that energy, that weight on them, that's when it gets especially claustrophobic. So let's move straight on then and do another quick exercise. You're going to switch voices now. We're going to jump across the lanes and you're going to write as that person whose object was just acted on by your original I voice, right? Chances are you know something about them now, however they've reacted, however your I voice watched them react. You might have an idea perhaps of why your original I voice might have acted on that object in the first place. Are they righting a perceived wrong, or is there something bigger going on perhaps? What you're going to do in your new voice is you're going to write a letter back to your original character, apologising for what's just happened. That might sound a little bit odd and counterintuitive, but it might not lead anywhere, but go with me. I want you to bear in mind, though, while you're writing, another classic law of physics, the second law of thermodynamics, which states, in a closed system, everything tends towards entropy, by which, in this case, I mean collapse. So in a closed system, things just disintegrate until they are nothing, basically. Collapse isn't where we want our plot or our characters to end up, is it? We don't want everyone to just end up just destroying each other. So we need to open things up a little bit sometimes. Open up that system in which our actions are happening. Bring in something new, a new place for that bad act to move into. So bear that in mind as you're writing your apology, please. So remember, your new character is going to apologise for the fact that your original character broke their stuff or did something to a part of their property. How can you open up the system that your first two pieces of writing created? Give yourself 10 minutes and I'll see you in a bit. Welcome back to part 4, the final act. I'm going to call this part Blame the System, Overarching Morality. The system's the last thing we're going to consider today, and this is the bit where I'm going to waffle on for a while, so hopefully that coffee's still got some heat in it perhaps, or you've got a new one. Systems, such as they are, answer for a lot, for everything in some cases, particularly in fiction. In her latest book, The Force of Non-Violence, the philosopher Judith Butler talks a lot about who, in any system, gets to define what violence actually is. If you've got a character that's operating against the system, and they're performing these immoral acts that we've just explored perhaps, these violent acts, then you have to consider who it is in that system that gets to define those acts as violent. So if you look at Margaret Atwood as an example, as many of us do, it's not just the state of Gilead in A Handmaid's Tale, is it? But in many of her books, there are these patriarchal expectations that have created a system in which women are forced into a position of mistrust and competitiveness. That's kind of her deal. And it leads to the flawed actions of many of her narrators. But they're not bad characters. They do bad things against a bad system, and they kind of cancel each other out. In many ways, maybe it's an easier trick to pull off if you're writing dystopian fiction or sci-fi, or if you're basing your story in any creative world that isn't this one. You get to set the world up to be unfair or inherently wrong, and then any character's actions against that world are kind of forgiven by default. Also, any individual action can always be countered by having your anonymous and passive voiced state go one step or even 5 steps further in terms of morality. But this idea of systems apply especially to the contemporary as well. And Margaret Atwood said, remember, that there's nothing that happens in Gilead that doesn't have precedent in the real world. And the same is true of The Power by Naomi Alderman. All of these events have their precedents in the real world. These are things that real people have done to each other. Within those worlds, then, violence is a kind of power, it's a kind of control. There's a hierarchical system, and violence is used to suppress those below, and that kind of counter-violence, which we don't define as violence perhaps, but as an active resistance, is pushing back up. Judith Butler outlines another justification for violence that, to me, is more interesting. It's more complex, it's more personal. She says, and she quotes a number of studies in this, that violence is a product on some level of empathy. That violence is a response to our ability to imagine other minds in other bodies. We are capable as human beings of imagining the act of inflicting pain on others or on objects. You've done that today. You've imagined that act of inflicting a violence on something, which by proxy may well have been the act of inflicting violence upon another person. We've looked at that from a few angles. So it's a small step, therefore, to imagine that other people do this too. That other people are imagining inflicting pain on other people all the time. And maybe we are that other person. Maybe other people are imagining inflicting pain upon us. What we're not so good at, Judith Butler says, is granting people the same level of self-restraint that we know we have. So if we let ourselves, or if we're guided to, we can imagine countless people who are all willing and capable of inflicting violence upon other persons, maybe even our persons, and who are not able to control themselves. What that does is create this terrifying feedback loop, which in the right environment can lead directly to that individual acting in what they see as self-defense. So if you throw into this any kind of social imbalance or anything on the spectrum from inherent bias to active isms, you've got people who are acting, perhaps in their own mind, and on one level at least completely rationally, against what they perceive to be a threat of violence against them. And that's where violence comes from. So I think we have to ask ourselves, particularly in contemporary fiction, to what extent are these flawed characters, these bad characters perhaps that we create, to what extent are they also victims of that system? So often in fiction we give voice to the outsider, to the obvious victim perhaps. Is it possible to create sympathy for someone who's operating within these prejudicial systems, if we can see their actions as in some way not their own? It's a big question. It's something that I had in the back of my mind when I was writing Grow, and I'm not sure I've answered it. And maybe it's not hugely useful advice for writing, but I do believe that writing and reading is, if nothing else, an exercise in empathy. At the moment, there are so many books out there that are written by people who are exploring their own experiences of these systems. And the books on that topic that I've read have been absolutely vital in shaping how I try to present character and how I've tried to craft Josh's voice on the page within Grow. And it was a top-down kind of practice, these ideas, these social constructs filtering into the novel. But it was meeting in the middle a close attention to detail and occupying the moment from a writing perspective that made up the bones of the novel, all of these events. The intense noticing, if you like, that created each event that we did back at the start of the workshop. And that's the bottom-up part of the practice. So we're back to this hourglass shape again, aren't we, perhaps? That everything you know about the world and everything you know about how people work meets up in your writing with everything that you know about craft. And that the purpose of craft, perhaps, is to serve the honesty and the integrity that you as a writer are bringing to your characters, with all their good and bad, and how you're trying to represent that on the page. It's been my absolute pleasure to talk to you today, wherever you may be in the world, about some of the ideas that I had when I was writing Grow. And hopefully I've given you something you can take away, something you can work on, something you can work with, or just something to think about. Which is just as important to the writing process, isn't it, as actually putting pen to paper or words on a screen. So thank you very much for coming along. Thank you for committing and for taking part. And maybe further down the line, we will meet again. Goodbye.